So welcome along to Chelmsford Market, and I've been looking into the history of why this particular market is here. But what the story starts back in Roman times, and the Romans were the first ones to bring markets to Chelmsford, and they had a settlement in Molsham Street in the 1st century. But their actual market in Chelmsford, we have to go forward to 1199, and a Bishop of London called William St. Enclise from Normandy. Now he decided that he wanted his land to actually then be turned partly into a market. So he applied to King John, and King John gave him permission and ownership of the land. He could then get market traders in and start to form a proper market. Now, the people that lived in Chelmsford then all worked for the bishop, so they weren't market traders. The market traders that came in were mostly French from Normandy, and they set up the market and they bought the actual plots. They became known as townsmen, whereas the local people were more the workers in the fields. In 1201, the bishop went one further and actually applied for an annual market to be set up in Chelmsford, a fair, a biannual fair, and that existed alongside the market. The market day was then Fridays, and they started out by selling things like bread and ale and cheese. But even at that point, they were worried that the quality was not quite good enough. So they had a local bailiff go round and do ale tasting and bread tasting and checking for weights and measures, just to make sure that whoever bought in the market got a good deal. The administration centre was then set up as the Great Cross. Now this was a building that was in front of where Shire Hall is now. Tyndall Square then was known as Market Square, and that was the main centre of the market. Now the layout of the High Street originally did not have a middle row. That appeared later. The middle row was started life as a row of stalls which slowly got bigger and bigger and more permanent. In 1327, the actual merchants had expanded, and they had then increased the actual goods that could be traded in the market. And we had wine merchants, we had spicers, we had butchers, we had wool merchants, and we even had a tailor. Now there was a fresh water supply running down the High Street, and this had been installed by the Black Friars back in the 13th century. They had managed to find a spring out at Burgess Well near Coval Lane and helped the town actually run that pipeline all the way up to the Conduit Square, which was then the Market Square. The water then flowed down the High Street. So with all this fresh water flowing through the High Street, it was able to cleanse the market on a fairly regular basis, which was really quite helpful to making the place quite good for people to buy their goods. Around 1370, a fish market appeared, and that was in the area that we now know as Half Moon Square. Next to it was a leather market, and just further down the street was Poultry Hill, where people could buy chickens and ducks and various other wild fowl. 10 years later, the Corn Exchange, the Market Cross is then used as the Corn Exchange. Interesting idea, in 1385, 5 butchers were fined for selling bad meat and charging for it. There was also some rough dealing going on with the fishmongers, where they were buying up their stock early and selling it late at a profit. In 1390, wool and woolens were the most profitable commodities in the market. the innkeepers and the traders were all then able to supply the people travelling through Chelmsford on their way up and down the Eastern Road. And this meant that there was horse people involved and blacksmiths and various other people related to that. They also had tailors that were making tunics and coats and making shoes as well, all for sale in the market on a Friday. Now, between Spring Lane, Springfield Road, and the Stone Bridge, there sprung up the smiths, and these were blacksmiths who were using sheds to work their metal, and they had a forge right in the middle of the high street where they used to all share the nice heat that was coming off. Now, in the 14th, 15th century, there's no mention at all of the cattle market. This was probably happening at the quarterly fairs. The big change was in 1545, when the bishops submitted the market as it was, the land, over to the crown, King Henry VIII. But in 1563, Queen Elizabeth I sold the entire land to Thomas Mildmay of Molsham, and he became the new owner of the whole of this area. Now, the growth of the market then really was getting quite big. All the properties had been taken up, and there were now sheep and cattle being traded on the area in front of the main Great Cross. In 1644, traders from Danbury and Malden were charged for selling oysters and using false measures to actually sell to people. So there was a bit of outsiders coming in and not quite giving the market the reputation it deserved. In 1791, the Great Cross was replaced by the Shire Hall. And the Shire Hall then became the Corn Exchange and also the new administration centre for the market. In May 1800, it was realised that the cattle at the top of the high street were causing a problem and they needed to be moved, and so they were shifted over to a field near Townsfield Street. They were cordoned off in the area by iron posts made in the Anchor Iron Works, and the rope that was actually linking the iron posts together was made by Henry Godfrey, the rope maker. In 1851, the market was then changed. The market in Tyndall Square was then changed, and it became Tyndall Square, not Market Square anymore. At the same time, the fountain stopped and the water stopped flowing. Now, an account from Frederick Spalding, who was born in Tyndall Square in 1858, said that he remembers the market stalls in the square and the auctioneers auctioning off the cattle. He also remembers a bull that broke loose from the pavement and ran at his father's shop. It ran through number 4 of the High Street, up the stairs onto the second floor, where they managed to actually get it under control and bring it back. But it would have caused quite a bit of damage. He also remembers at the same time there was a chap called Richard Hassler, who was known as Dick the Pie Man, and he would be peddling his pies in his white apron and his straw boater, crying, hot pies, rich and ready, one a penny, fine hot pies." The house next to there was known as Wallinger's, and Wallinger's was the site that was bought and then became the Corn Exchange. They opened for business in 1855, and the administration for the market then moved to the new Corn Exchange. In 1860, the Board of Health were then looking to oust the market from the High Street. But it took until 1874 before they could actually buy a piece of land next to the Corn Exchange to actually make that happen. Now, meanwhile, the market, the trading of animals, was needed to be moved as well. And they bought this piece of land and also part of the grammar school that was at the top of the high street, and they made Market Road by knocking down part of the Great Golden Lion Inn. Meanwhile, the retail market eventually was taken from the high street and put in the piece of land next to the Corn Exchange in 1949, but to do that they had to demolish the Bell Inn. Now in 1969 the Corn Exchange was demolished and the retail market then moved to this location. The cattle market moved from here to Victoria Road, and then a few years later in the 1980s that was taken over by the Riverside Retail Park. The retail park then took over that slot and they then moved it up to Boreham, the final location for the cattle market where it finally disbanded altogether. But let's just think about where the market first started, in the high street. And it's funny that a few years ago the council did actually allow market stalls back in the high street where they originally were. And now today we can buy cheese and pie and various other things in the high street, with the whole story turning full circle. So that's the history of the market, and thank you for listening.